I like to think of the film Arrival as a science fiction movie for people who don't like science fiction. Instead of Darth Vader or dogfights between ships in outer space, Arrival is a rather cerebral film and poses some interesting questions. The plot centers around 12 extraterrestrial spacecraft that land at various places around the world, and true to form, the ships are surrounded immediately by military forces in each locale, but the aliens make no hostile moves. In fact, they seem to be trying to communicate. Enter linguistic specialist Louise Banks, played by Amy Adams, who is brought in to try and decipher their language. She discovers they have a written language of complicated circular symbols, and she begins to learn a basic vocabulary. Now, if you've ever studied a different language, you know that translation is never a simple replacement of one word or phrase for another. For example, when Louise asks the aliens why they have come to Earth, they answer, "Offer weapon." But the linguists working with one of the other spacecraft translate the phrase as "use weapon." Well, at that point, all the nations of the world are thrown into a panic, and they stop exchanging information with each other because they don't want anybody to one-up them. Louise, however, argues the symbol interpreted as weapon might really mean tool. You see, just knowing the words is not enough to comprehend what's really being said. The reason why I wanted to talk about Arrival this morning is because today is Pentecost Sunday. And the story in Acts 2, I think, raises some of the same issues as the movie. Is it enough to just know the words? Well, this story in Acts says, no, it's not. Those folks from Parthia and Media and Elam and Cappadocia and Pontus and Egypt and everywhere else heard the words the disciples were saying, but the text says all were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" They heard the words, but they didn't know what they meant. They didn't understand the reality of the words conveyed. Kind of reminds me of my recent trip to Italy. We went to Venice and went up into the bell tower to look out over these magnificent vistas of the city. And I noticed where my sisters were standing, they were looking, and there was an island jutting out into the middle of the water. And I suddenly remembered a birthday card my sister had sent me several years ago. So I walked up behind both of them and pointed to that spit of land, and in my best redneck voice, I said, "You see that part sticking out over there? That's called a stick out." Well, they all laughed. And just then we heard two French girls standing a few feet away, and pardon me, I don't speak any French, but they said something like, "Mon Dieu, c'est une, let's stick out." Those gals probably went back home to France and told their friends, "We learned that spit of land's called a stick out." Might even make it into a guidebook someday. Now, they heard the words, but they didn't know what they meant. "What does this mean?" asked the crowd on Pentecost. In Arrival, Louise says of the aliens, we need to find out, do they make conscious choices, or is their motivation so instinctive they don't even understand a why question at all? And biggest of all, we have to know enough vocabulary that we can understand their language. In one of Edgar Allan Poe's novels, the narrator says, "I seemed to be on the verge of comprehension without power to comprehend." On the verge of comprehension. Throughout much of Arrival, Louise is on the verge of comprehension without power to comprehend. Comprehension, real understanding, doesn't come to Louise until one of the aliens helps her to see that their language is circular because they perceive time as circular, not linear. And their language is their weapon or tool for seeing into the future. Now, I don't want to say more about it because for those of you who haven't seen the film, it'll give away too much of the ending. But suffice it to say that Louise spends most of the movie on the verge of comprehension, and only when the aliens help her to broaden her perspective on time does she ever truly comprehend. Likewise, the Pentecost crowd is merely on the verge of comprehension until Peter stands up and explains what's happening. He said, this event was foreseen by the prophets. And he introduces the crowd to a whole new perspective on who Jesus was and what Jesus did. And he concludes by saying, therefore let the entire house of Israel know with certainty that God has made him both Lord and Messiah, this Jesus whom you crucified. Well, then they understood more than just the words. Then they comprehended what was happening in their midst, and they cried out, what should we do? And according to the story, 3,000 people were baptized that day. Now, in our super individualized, go it alone culture, we don't like the suggestion that we're not sufficient within ourselves. Even as full-grown adults, registered voters, and licensed drivers, we haven't progressed much beyond the 2-year-old who declares, I do it myself. But you know what? Being on the verge of knowing how to dress yourself isn't the same as being able to dress yourself. And being on the verge of comprehension isn't the same as comprehension. You need others to help you get you there. So when it comes to discipleship, just knowing the words isn't enough. Being on the verge of comprehending discipleship isn't the same as practicing discipleship. You and I need others to help us cross that threshold. Of course, some will protest, but Paris, can't God's Holy Spirit teach me and guide me all by myself? And I answer, yes. I don't want to limit God. But look at the story in Acts 2. The Holy Spirit doesn't come to an individual. The Holy Spirit comes to a crowd in the upper room. And then the Holy Spirit comes to a crowd outside the upper room. And most of the other stories in Acts about the Holy Spirit's work have to do with community, not individuals. You see, I believe the Holy Spirit not only resides within us, but also between us. I don't need you in order to learn the vocabulary of discipleship. I got 2 seminary degrees. I know more of that vocabulary than you do. But I do need you if I'm going to learn the practice of discipleship. I do need you if I'm going to get an answer to the question of what does this mean? Left only to myself, I will forever be on the verge of comprehension, knowing the vocabulary but not knowing what the words mean. I need God's Spirit, the very Spirit given at Pentecost, to help me cross that threshold. And I will find that Spirit at work in the space between us. If you haven't seen the movie Arrival, you've probably seen the movie or the play called The Miracle Worker, about Anne Sullivan and Helen Keller. Helen Keller, you probably recall, lost her sight and her hearing, probably from scarlet fever, when she was 19 months old. And until age 7, she was a totally unruly, spoiled child, lost in her dark and silent world. But then Anne Sullivan came to live with the family and attempted to change Helen's life. Sullivan spent months spelling words into Helen's hand, but Helen couldn't make the connection between the words spelled into her hand and the world around her. For Helen, they were just finger games. In the play, she mimics the finger positions Sullivan makes in her hand, but to her, they're just amusements. They're basically meaningless to her. Then in the final scene, the family's trying to have a nice dinner at home, and Helen reverts back to the same old wild behavior at the table that Sullivan thought she'd left behind. She deliberately knocks over the pitcher of water and spills its contents onto the table. Ann snatches her up along with the pitcher and drags her, kicking and screaming, out into the yard to the pump to fill up the pitcher. She makes Helen hold the pitcher under the pump handle, and as the water splashes into the pitcher and sloshes onto Helen's hand, Ann grabs her other hand and spells the word into her hand for the millionth time, W-A-T-E-R. Water, she says. It has a name, W-A-T-E-R. Suddenly she notices a different look on Helen's face. Ann pumps the water again and again spells the word into her hand, W-A-T-E-R. And then Helen purses her lips. And from her mouth comes a word she remembered from long ago. A word she had learned to speak in those days before she became deaf and blind. A word she learned when she was just a precocious toddler. Wah. Wah. She grabs Ann's hand and spells W-A-T-E-R. Ann puts Helen's hand on her face and nods, yes, yes. Wah, wah, W-A-T-E-R. Yes, yes, nods Helen. Helen falls to the ground on her knees and pounds the ground and holds out her hand, and Ann spells into it G-R-O-U-N-D, and Helen responds G-R-O-U-N-D. She grabs hold of the pump, and Ann spells P-U-M-P, and Helen responds P-U-M-P. She runs to a tree, T-R-E-E, she spells T-R-E-E, Helen responds. She runs to the porch, S-T-E-P, she says S-T-E-P, Helen responds. She grabs hold of the clapper on the bell and rings it B-E-L-L, B-E-L-L, and then Ann shouts out, Mrs. Keller, Mrs. Keller, and her mom and dad come running out onto the porch, and Helen wraps her arms around both of them while Ann spells into their hands M-O-T-H-E-R. P-A-P-A. And Ann says, she knows. She knows. Understanding the words isn't enough. Real comprehension comes through the movement of God's Spirit between us. Then we know. We know.